Well, good morning, everybody, and it's still time to wish you a happy and prosperous new year. Thanks for coming despite the cool or cold weather. So thanks for being here. We have a couple of people also online, if I'm not mistaken. So for the Q&A, of course, if you are in the room, it's easy. Just wave your hand and I'll give you the floor. For the others online, I'll try to manage the questions. And well, Celine will remind me if I forget something. So we are delighted today to discuss a topic that has become quite hot. And it is the expansion of Korea's defense industry. It came a little bit as a surprise to a number of people that Korea became an active player in this field. And so what we are going to do today is try to understand how Korea became such an active player. How is it that Korea is interested in developing such an industry, and what are the respective roles of private sector, the state? Well, your sense, I guess, is that the state must have been quite active in this respect, as it is always the case in Korea. And so we have Dr. PAIK, who will explain that to us. Dr. PAIK is professor at Yonsei University, but he has spent quite some time now in Paris at IRSEM. And well, where I understand he worked primarily on this very topic. And to challenge him to discuss what he will have said, we have Arnaud Levaux with us, who is a close friend to the Center for Asian Studies, who's been with Airbus at some point in his professional life, and who is also professor. Where do you teach? Paris Dauphine. Okay. So we have two excellent speakers, I guess. And so without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. PAIK for, I don't know, some 30 minutes or so. And I want to let you know also that after this seminar, there will be a publication by Professor PAIK on the same topic. So it may not happen right away. It will be published in the course, I guess, of February. And it will be based to a large extent on the presentation that he will have given to this morning. Everything is okay technically? Yeah, okay. So Dr. PAIK, the floor is yours.
This is how it works?
Apparently it works. Okay. I guess you need to switch your mic. Your mic.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, here we go. Hi, this is Wooyeal PAIK. Yeah, thanks for the good introduction. And then thank you for coming for me and my challenger. That's great. I'm one more time Wooyeal PAIK from Yonsei University, South Korea. I'm working in the Policy department in Yonsei University, and then at the same time, École Militaire AScent as a visiting fellow. The last one sabbatical year. As Francois mentioned, and it was a pretty interesting phenomenon for, I think it's Korea or East Asia watcher or the Europe watchers across the world, the expansion of the South Korean defense industry. And then you ever heard a lot about South Korea's defense industry in Europe, especially in Central Eastern European country. That, for example, Poland in the last few years, and it's interesting for these countries to react to South Korea's defense industrial emergence in Europe and then beyond. I will explain a little bit about South Korea's defense industry. I have three goals today. First is illustrating some basic facts and then perceptions on Korean defense industry. And I'm not sure, I think it's the most, the audience is French, and then some, diplomatical in Paris. So probably it's good for me to illustrate a little bit about basic things, and then explaining some critical dynamics between defense industry and then security that revolves around, Korean defense industry's growing presence in Europe and beyond. It's not just Europe, and then, South Korea's defense industry doing extremely well in the Middle East. The most recent deal actually is a negotiate with, Saudi Arabia and, UAE as a major, customer. At the same time, Southeast Asia and then Oceania, especially, Australia, the Redback, the infantry fighting vehicles, and on and on and on, many things going on. And so it is pretty interesting, for just check up, what's going on in Europe and then beyond. And last thing is I wanted to propose, more discussion and then cooperation between Korea and France, and then probably, Europe on defense industry, and then why important for the, security and beyond. And then that's what I'm going to do, the three things. Today, I will have, three parts. First part is just, introduction. And then second part is, first thing is the defense industrial products. I think it's, I don't know how many people are working for the defense industry right here, but, I will, just very briefly, just introduce, these products. And then producers, we have 6 major defense industry, industrial the manufacturers. So I will explain them. And then, the role of government. And then role of government, it's important for any defense industry anywhere, the United States, France, and then Germany, UK, and even Turkey, and then you can almost use India, on and on and on. But Korean government role is very, very profound in the Korean defense industrial development. So I'll explain about that. And then the dynamics. And then the second part is regionally of the Korea defense industrial development. How South Korea actually emerged as one of the, say, top 8, 9, 7, the weapons producers. Again, I will explain that, but, South Korea was just poor country without any technology. And, what's going on, what happened? We just encounter many, say, Korean things, the cultural Korean wave and, economy, semiconductor, batteries, and many things going on, economy, culture and technology. But, what about, defense industry? How South Korea, could do this, and then what are the strengths and then weaknesses?
You can continue. Just
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Thank you, Selin. And then last part, it's a strengths and weakness. I will briefly go over. I think I don't have just very extended time. Korea, Korean defense industry is getting a lot of more attention, but at the same time, you can see this Korean defense industry has, pretty good, but at the same time, it has weakness too. And then to overcome. So I will just tackle, strengths and weakness very briefly. And, I'm political scientist. I'm not a, arms dealer, merchant of death, as you know. And, working on international relations and then security is multi-dimensional security. That's what I'm doing. So its implication for global defense industry at the same time, security in Europe and, other parts of the world. Can I just do it?
Yeah.
Okay. Did I something wrong?
No.
Okay. Korea, it's the fact. Means it's 2022. I think it's the statistical data actually. It's assembled right now. It will be announced probably in a few months. The $3 billion USD, the total export. It was 2012 to 2021, but it's 2022. It's just 17.3 billion USD. Obviously, it's not much probably in comparison with the United States, but it's growing very fast, approaching very quickly, to the top. So I think it's 3, 4, 5, 6, the weapons produced, mostly are the European. Its sales contract actually, across the globe is stockpiling. I just briefly mentioned that the Middle East and then Southeast Asia and then Oceania and then Central Eastern European countries, and then this is stockpiling. So Ministry of Defense and then those 6 major the producers are very busy in negotiating, just flying all over the place, just to negotiate, get those deals too. At the same time, the President Yoon Yonsei, that's Korean president, and then he's flying all over the place, to get those things, those deals, done. So now we are South Korea actually labeled as a democracy arsenal. This is value added, value oriented, the nickname. So that's the democracy arsenal supposed to be the United States, but United States and France and other countries cannot fulfill those the say obligation or duty. So South Korea filled the gap. And then, from the, American point of view, they say, South Korea has entered the major league of, this defense industry. Major league is Major League Baseball. So it's, top, 5, 6, 7, they are, doing very well. That's what they are saying. So democracy and then major league, and then they actually symbolize South Korea's emergence as a defense industrial, powerhouse. Again, I just briefly mentioned that I think it's along with Turkey, Korea is the first country, from not a aid recipient, aid donor, at the same time, defense industry weapons, importer, to defense the weapons, the exporters. So it is a very interesting phenomenon. And if you just take a look at this history of defense industry after World War II, you cannot find this type of case. South Korea is probably one and only case, from just absolutely nothing to actually competing with the top dogs in the defense industry. This is pretty interesting phenomenon. I'm not nationalist, but people say it's a lot of things in South Korea. I will explain about domestic political, the agendas in South Korea in terms of defense industry. But South Korean people get really emotional about this type of achievement. So we will discuss about it. And at the same time, that actually makes South Korea being carried away in many senses. All right. So international arms trade and war industry, and then as we know, these are very conservative. Top 6 or 7, probably 8 countries, they dominate everything, over 90%. Entire arms export. United States, 39%. Russia, 19%. France, 11%. As we see that, 2023, I think France is number 2 rather than number 3. Russia is actually the fading away in many senses, and then China, Germany, Italy, and then UK. That's the second tier, and then they actually occupy over 80%, over 85% of the entire global arms market. But this reason is pretty obvious: extremely complex, defense industry, and then very highly barriered. It's very hard for the newcomer to crack in. It is because very high level of technology, of course, and a large scale of contract and finance. At the same time, they're keen political consideration. So those developing countries, such as say India, and then Turkey, and then Brazil, and then those countries have a very hard time to crack in. And South Korea is one of them. What's going on? So now it's Korea. It's emerged up to the 8th ranker, 2.8% and further, probably 2023. And I think South Korea is going a little bit upper, probably number 7, probably not number 6, but I think that's what's going on. So this Korea, if you remember, I just say it's just number 10, number 11, outside of number 10, but it is South Korea's the emergence as a in defense industrial power. So it's just so amazing. This is, I will explain a little bit about those product. You can see that this is Dosan Anchangho class. Submerged 3,750 ton level, a very high level, the submarine. And then the other side, you can see this. This is you can see the Korean flag and then Poland flag. This is K2 main battle tanker, 3.5 generation. And then the other side, you can see that this is the airplane, the FA 50 light jet fighter, which is compatible with the F-16 and F-35. And then the other thing is this K2 self-propelled howitzer. This is occupying. I've heard more about 60% of entire the self-howitzer market in 2020 2023. And then another one is ML RS, this is Chunmu. This is a multi-launch rocket system. This is one of the major the arms export material from Korea. Now it's in I think it's the UAE, and then the Poland got it. This is pretty similar with some system from the United States. So these are the major the product, but that's not the end of story. I don't think you can read all of them, but I'm not going to explain one by one, but you can see just the weapons lineup is extremely comprehensive. I think it's you can just take a look at the list, lineup of weapons produced in France, and then UK or Germany, Russia probably, and then you will see many things very similar. Guns, and then ammunition, especially those new specific gold in ammunition to the 155 millimeter howitzer shell, which is a really, really high demand, due to the Ukraine war and then Israel-Hamas war right now. And South Korea actually have plenty of the production capacity, and then sell to many countries, including the United States. The armed vehicle, Redback infantry fighting, vehicles actually, got the huge contract. I think it's about 3 billion USD with, the Australia last, I think, November. And the main battle tank is K2 Black Panthers are best sellers, are selling very well. Poland actually, decided to import, 1,000 K2 Black Panther. And then self-propelled howitzer, I just mentioned the K9, self-propelled howitzer, and it has a complete package and resupply vehicle, and then self-propelled other, CNC, command and control, vehicle too. And then MLS-RS, and then, portable anti, tank, missiles, just like, American Javelin. And the naval weapons actually also King Sejong class destroyer. South Korea is famous for the shipbuilding industry, and that actually translated into those defense purpose shipbuildings too. And the submarine also, it's in Dosan Anchangho class, the submarine I just briefly mentioned, and then they are the primary candidate for the Polish the Oka the project. At the same time, Canadian, the next generation, submarine, candidate, which actually is have a France and French and then German producers are also joining in the bidding and then competing with the Korea and other countries. And then aerospace weapons is too, but South Korea again I will explain about the weakness, but it's not top class in aerospace weapons. But first, it's it has a light jet fighter, but at the same time, KF-21 4.5 generation jet fighter. That is a 4.5 generation jet fighter. It will be mass produced in the supply chain, and then this year, and it will be it is co-developed with Indonesia. But at the same time, Poland has a high, interest in the, co-developing this, KF-21, probably in Block 2 or Block 3. So, and you can say that the satellite and then launch vehicle, South Korea has, very good launch vehicles, and this tightly related to, intercontinental capability. At the same time, this, satellite launching capability, you can see that. And then ballistic missiles, South Korea and ballistics, and cruise missiles at the same time. Cheongung MSAM Block 2 also is selling extremely well. At the same time, Hyunmu 4 ballistic missiles and Hyunmu 5. This is more like ILBM. It's recently decided to mass produce in this year. And things like that. You can see many things in South Korea. The defense industrial products. And there are 6 major companies. I think it's if you are working in the defense industry, you are familiar with these names, but probably not. You will see these names a lot more in coming years. The Hanwha Aerospace, this is top South Korean the weapons maker, and they merged in the Korean the other Korean top makers such as Daewoo shipbuilding industry, something like that, And then they actually have a very, comprehensive lineup, for the weapons, ground, naval, and then aerospace. And Korea aerospace industry, this is SKY. This is, the created, I think it's around 2000s, after IMF crisis in South Korea. South Korea government actually merged, I think, 5 or 6 different company to, one this country in charge of making those aerospace, defense industrial products. They is KAI. So you can see that the role of, South Korean government in defense industry. Hyundai Rotem, that's the main battle tank, and then LIG next one, this missiles and aerospace and the satellite and everything, and then Hyundai Heavy Industry, this is Navy. There's submarines and then destroyers, and then the other things. And then Pungsan, I think you never heard about probably Pungsan, but Pungsan is the ammunition. It's a really hot commodity, and then they are very popular, and then got a lot of attention from the United States and then Ukraine too. So they are the major producer of the 155, and then with other countries, of course. So these are the big products and then producers. And if you can take a look at it, this government-private company joint venture structure. So I'm briefly explain about Korea's South Korean defense industry's structure. It's more like joint venture model. And then I think it's France and the US have a kind of similar, but I think it's the matter of degree. In terms of matter of degree, South Korea is way deeper than the other two, the countries. The government agencies and private companies cooperate. And then first thing is, if you want to remember, then Defense Acquisition Program, administration under the National, Ministry of National, Defense, consider, requirement institution that's, demands by each field of ground in Navy and Air Force. And then, they actually, decide to do this, do that, product. And then, the Agency for Defense Development. This is the key, institution of South Korean government. They in charge of almost everything in terms of R&D, research and development. So they are the technology, the juggernaut. Thousands, 7,000, 8,000 of people and researchers are working there, and then they are the primary. It's more like brain of Korean defense industry. And then they actually pass to those technologies to linked private companies like 5 or 6 companies I mentioned that they get technology transfer, co-develop, and then materialize final products for sales in domestic and international market. Supported by export credit, agents, more like, K-Shore, you say, and then, Korean Exim Bank and other things. So if you can take a look at this, this is the, very, tightly connected, amalgamated, the structure of Korean, South Korean, defense industry. You can see. I'm not saying that, those private industry are not just, piggybacking on the ADD exclusively. But if you say then 70-80% of technology from the ADD, and then the other 20-30% from the just those private makers. But private makers technology level is pretty high too, and then you can see that they can save a lot of money for depending on just ADD for research and development. And that 40-50%, even 60% of entire expense for the new technology, I mean weapons development, is depend on the R&D. So ADD, DAPA, ECA. I think if you can remember those three, the government institution, you will have a little bit better understanding, grasp of South Korean's defense industrial, structure. So they are tightly connected with those makers. Oh, why is this? Okay. Ooh. Then how Korean defense industry been able to sustain such a long build-up process? 50 years at least. It took 50 years, for South Korea to reach this point, and then 50 years is quite a long time. And then, as you say, this is just low efficient, low profit, and then everything takes to justify many things for the developing countries to in defense industry. So what are the major, main rationale for the Korean defense industrial success? There are 4 elements. Thank you, Francois. You just, to point out this, categorization, 3 structural and 1 facilitating, among others. Number 1, North Korea. Without North Korea, South Korea couldn't do it. This is, we call it, the North Korea is the brother nemesis. We are in the one, ethnic group, and then we share the history, and then we try to be reunited, South Korea and North Korea, but at the same time, military confrontation. We are at war, South Korea and North Korea, never had a, peace treaty. Since the 1953 at the end of Korean War, but I'm not saying that the end of Korean War is because it's still at war technically. So North Korea is a justification for South Korea to just recklessly invest all those monies and times and human resources, energy. Okay, so there was one of the most important reasons. The other developing countries do not have this type of motivation, to be honest with you. And then Turkey, well, you can say Russia, but but the others, think about India. Yes, it has Pakistan, but Pakistan, if you say that this is really, is a little bit different. But North Korea in 50s and 60s, 70s were better and more capable than South Korea. South Korea had no choice but to develop, and then justification, and then citizens who got a lot of tax burdens, to spend a lot of money on the defense industry. Yes, they say, okay, we gotta do this. And then number 2 is the international partnership with the United States. United States, it's a very unique presence, international presence for, I think, everybody, including France. France has a strategic autonomy, right? And then European strategic autonomy we need to think about. But South Korea, the United States is very special. Korean War, after Korean War, South Korea got all those weapons almost exclusive from the United States. It's more like donation rather than sales. It's a huge, and at the same time, right now, I will explain more, but, United States is just too important for South Korea's own security. And, major powers. France, Germany played a very important role, to, technology transfer. South Korea actually got a lot of technologies. Of course, South Korea actually paid quite a bit. France and, Germany, and then Israel actually played quite important role. But at the same time, the Russia and the Ukraine also play very, very important role, for South Korea, especially, missiles and other, aerospace, technologies. So it's very ironic, South Korea is selling all those weapons to so-called, the enemy of, the Russia right now. So this is very, very interesting. So, and then, domestic partisan, bipartisan political support. South Korea is extremely polarized. Political society. If you think about Democrats and Republicans in the United States, we have conservative and progressive. But very few, this bipartisan consensus. One of them is defense industrial, advancement. Last 5 or 6 presidents, whether he or she is a progressive conservative, absolutely, 100%. And I'll explain, a little bit the motivation later. If you are, okay. And the last one, final trigger. Ukraine-Russian war actually opened up the opportunity for the time and space for South Korean defense industry to get in a European market. And then all those 3 efforts and then conditions and 50 years efforts were not enough for Korea. And then this war actually triggered the structural change of European defense market. I think, those who are attending in here and then online, and I think I'm very familiar with this, structural change of the European defense, security, structural security chain. At the same time, it actually changed the defense market. The Europe need more weapons. And then, but basically, European major makers cannot fulfill those demand, and then United States cannot do. And who else? Korea. Why Korea? Because Korea was there. It's not just intended, just happened to be there. It's a coincidence. It is just a mixture of the, say, long history of South Korean efforts, at the same time, coincidental, the opportunity for Korea. So European market is wide open for the defense industry. I'll briefly talk about Korea-Poland deal and others. And that actually gave South Korea much more leverage, across the, globe. If you crack in the European market, then you got a lot of endorsement, for the quality and then other things. So, all right, and then Korea-Poland arms deal. I think many of you are interested in this. And then now we are in Poland actually, the going through these domestic political changes. The Donald Tusk and civic team, the civic coalition, got the power. But President Duda and PAIK is still there. So this is interesting dynamics, we can discuss about it later. But the deal is just enormous. Look at that. Main battle tank 1,000 unit. Self-howitzer is 620-72. FA Lot J fighter is 48 unit, and MLS in 288 unit. If you just think about just main battle tank and 10,000 unit, I think it's more than France and then Germany combined, or more like that. This is just huge number, unprecedented, to be honest with you. And then first phase it's already done, and second and third phases will be done. I'm not sure it's going to be and completely done by new Polish government, but I think this is the deal. Just this fear number, it's just overwhelming. And then that was a big difference maker. Yep. And so what's going on, and then what are the strengths of South Korea? And then one by one, I think I don't have enough time, but just competitive technology. But in the other way around is weakness too, but in a very competitive. Mass production capacity, I think it's many, the observers and analysts of defense industry pointing out that, European makers don't have this mass production capacity, especially in conventional weapons. But South Korea has. South Korea actually produced, just sheer number of, the main battle tank, self-howitzer, and, jet fighters and submarines and ships, and then ammunitions, on and on and on, because of course, in North Korea, one more time. So we have, the huge, the capacity on it, and a quick delivery time. And then it was, more like, just headline news. I think last year, South Korea actually delivered, main battle tank first patch. It's in 4 months. The contract done by, I think it's April, but it delivered by July or August. That's not possible. It's simply not possible in defense industry. It takes at least 5, 6, 7 years. Just first batch of the product. So it was just impressive, to others. It is because South Korean government actually decided give up, fulfill their demand, onto the front line, and then they actually, grab those, main battle tank out of their, the stock, to send to Poland. That's kind of commitment. So it was impossible without government consent or the commitment. So at the same time, reasonable cheap price. This is very strong, it's strong, the element. And then constant after sale maintenance, NATO standardized system. This is interesting. South Korea is not a NATO country, but its weapons are NATO compatible. I mean, the compatible. And then South Korea is American ally. American standard actually apply to South Korea. So a little bit of just feeble. It's just discrepancies here and there, but easy for South Korean makers to to fulfill this NATO standard. That actually appeals a lot to the Central and Eastern European countries. And then that actually for their the change of Soviet post-Soviet Soviet the weapons with the NATO standard weapons. Field tested South Korea and North Korea, so it's in full support of government. That's the the strength, but at the same time, it has a pretty obvious weakness too. South Korea is we call technology 1.5 or second tier technology. recently, for example, South Korea actually didn't have a power pack for the main battle tank, and they actually imported from the Germany. But it actually recently completed its power pack development, and then those Korean power pack will be installed in the K2 Black Panther, the main battle tank. But still, that's actually it says a long way to go. South Korea cannot produce gas turbine engine. This is the heart of any type of 4.5 or fifth generation jet fighter, and and it doesn't have a nuclear engine submarine. And then at the same time, it doesn't have nuclear weapons. And then, so you can see that this is, more like, the 1.5 second tier technology, not to mention the United States, but France and then Germany and then UK and Russia have a way more advanced, technology. This is a weakness of South Korea. And then second one is, constraint from the United States to export. United States is the key for South Korean, defense industry's advancement in development. South Korea actually got a lot of, technology from the United States, licensed production. At the same time, actually, South Korea, defense materials actually includes a lot of made in America, made in US, parts. And then they are not cheaper or not side ones, the primary hard one. So if the United States say no, and then South Korea cannot export to anywhere. So this is a big constraint, for the South Korea, the weakness. And then overproduction concern, European makers are hesitant to increase its production capacity. It is because after Ukraine war, the demand is dwindling. And that's going to be really big headache, European, the makers. But at the same, but South Korea, the same goes for South Korea. But South Korea has North Korea. So that type of thing. And then insufficient export financing system. And then recently, the Poland-South Korea deal actually was stagnant. Phase 1 was done, but phase 2 actually has a very hard difficulty, to proceed because South Korean government and banking system is not allowing to the huge, the financing, to the Poland. It's up to 80%. 80% of entire sales, the amount actually financed by a Korean, bank and then, financial system. And then South Korea need to, revise their, law, to allow this type of, financing, export financing to Poland and any other countries. And then passive investment in private companies and then tendency of being carried away with the sudden success. And I briefly mentioned, it's now South Korea, it's become more, say, nationalistic. And then, if you can take a look at those South Korean YouTube, and then, media reports, and then say, wow, we did this, we did that, we are very proud, and we are the top country. That type of thing, it's very premature, in my view. And then South Korean, government, and then, politicians, and then defense industry try to take advantage of this, of course, including the media. So this type of, the premature, say, complacence or achievement, and then that's, very, very risky and a weakness, for South Korea so far. Now, I think as I completed this, the first part illustrating, South Korean defense industry overview, and then I, mentioned briefly here and there, Poland and US and France. I think it's from Korea, in my perspective as a political scientist, its implication for the global defense and at the same time security is pretty significant. South Korea is a new kid on the block in the European defense industrial market, but it just say, whoa, surprise, surprise, another interesting guy or the entity animal just came to our house, and this is pretty okay, interesting, but. In fact, it's tightly related to global, security structural change. Let me just briefly explain about it. One by one. The United States, how United States actually see the South Korean defense industrial emergence. And the United States is not a competitor of the South Korean defense from the defense industrial point of view. South Korea actually play a complementary role in Central Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, Oceania. That means it's more like market. It's not overlapping with each other so far. United States is top tier. The producers. And then all kinds of the weapons across the field. South Korea is 1.5 or second tier, actually complementing and then with the American the makers and the government. And then I can say South Korean government and then the United States government closely coordinating this type of say sharing market or just producing this type of weapons, especially last a few years. South Korea actually needs the United States one more time. This is a defense industrial perspective. At the same time, South Korea's own security. South Korea is not nuclear state. Period. South Korea needs United States, for defending itself. North Korea has at least 80 to 100 nuclear warhead. It has ICBM. ICBM for the United States, probably Europe. But it has plenty of mid-range and short-range missiles to just bomb South Korea. So it's just by far absolutely South Korea needs the United States for that reason. But it's the other way around. The United States needs Korea in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. I will detail it a little bit later. But this is very complementary. So U.S. is very positive on South Korea's defense industrial expansion. But what about France and Germany? South Korea, I think these two countries, and then major European countries, say the UK, it's not European country. European, the EU country. I made this type of joke, and then my British friends actually very upset with me. And then I'm French, so I think I can do that. So it needs Korean arms sales in a European security theater right now. Again, in Ukraine, I don't need to explain, but just France and then Germany cannot fulfill, fill up the Polish and then the Central Eastern European, say Latvia and then Lithuania. And in those arsenals, South Korea is the only one country can do that so far. But likely regard Korea as a competitor more and more in coming years. So United States is up there. Of course, France is partly competing with United States in some sectors, but Korea is up there, just up and coming to compete more with France and then Germany across the field. And then technology across the most sectors more advanced than South Korea. I think I told you before, the French and German technology and UK technology, and Spain and Italy has a pretty confident technology too. But again, South Korea is up and coming. France now is competing with the number 2 spot with the Russia. I think France is going to be number 2 this year and then next year in coming years. And then Germany already, these two countries, and Germany also competing with Korea in multiple international bidding. For example, there's Polish, the next generation, submarine OCA project, and so many, the Middle East, countries, biddings and Oceanian biddings and Southeast Asia. You can see this type of, kind of tension is emerging between South Korea and the major European countries from defense industrial point of view. But what about Russia? Russia actually perceives Korea's increasing weapons export in Europe as a negative action, of course. And Poland, it's a major country, for the say challenging or say protecting more against the Russia, and those sheer number of the conventional weapons. Russia probably cannot use those tactical nuclear weapon, against NATO country, but they can invade, with the conventional weapons. So this type of thing actually, apply to this in Russians, strategic, capacity against, NATO countries, especially those Central and Eastern European countries. So Russia cannot be positive on, South Korea's defense industry expansion. And then, one more important, the element in Korea, Poland, and Korea other deals is it includes localization, package. license production, at the same time localization. South Korea will transfer this type of technology to Poland. Poland, and then very determined, to have its own defense industry. And then, as we know, United States, Germany, and then France has said no to the technology transfer to the other countries, including Poland. So South Korea is willing to do that. This is pretty rare opportunity for Poland. But at the same time, Poland and South Korea, it has a lot of obstacles right now, but they actually co-produce those the series, the very wide range of lineup of weapons. Then Poland and Central Eastern European country will be a very, very capable weapons producer. That's no sign for Russia, right? So, and then China too, but China hasn't responded to Korea's expansion, global market yet. But weapons sales to China's neighbor, to South and Southeast Asia, it's growing, but it's not compromising China's dominance, the military dominance in those region, aside from the United States, of course. So China is okay. But at the same time, South Korea is not selling the weapons to Taiwan. Taiwan needs those type of weapons I explained about, right? But South Korea has no intention to sell these weapons to Taiwan. That's a kind of red line for China to just get away. Okay with South Korea's expansion. And then but eventually it will concern China, because South Korea's defense industrial capacity actually it's complementing American capacity in Indo-Pacific region. Okay. And then that's very, very, the great could be concern for the China. And then Vietnam is the next target for South Korea's major makers too. So Vietnam and the China relationship, if you think about it, that's going to be pretty interesting for China to think about. And then this type of all kind of facts and analysis is tightly related to this security. I say these two security convergences, regional and then dimensional. Regional, the security convergence means Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic regions, and then especially the United States. United States has a it's still very vague, the concept, but integrated deterrence. It's not just domestic, but also international, multilateral, deterrence. The security architecture is the base or the bread and butter for the Biden administration. And then that's key, point is this integration or convergence between the Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic region. That actually, it's a very, very important part. And dimension two, conventional military, conventional security, but economic security. Francois she's the expert of economic security, technology security, political security, environmental. Those security actually combined, and then that actually it's obvious and evident in the South Korea's defense industrial expansion, and then that actually tightly related to the U.S.-China competition. Too. It's bilateral and the expanded format is supercharging this security structural changes. You can see this NATO AP4. NATO AP4 get a lot of attention from Europe and the Indo-Pacific region. This is NATO AP4 is 4 Asian partners. No. Asia Pacific partners. So the first one is Madrid 2 years ago. And then last year Vilnius, and then this year it's Washington, and then those I think is for the Indo-Pacific countries or Asia Pacific country committed to come. So this NATO AP4, it's a very interesting phenomenon right now, and then related to this. China came first. The AP4 came later. As we know, China is one of the primary region for these the Indo-Pacific countries to come to Europe, and then Ukraine-Russian war actually played a very important role. And then those countries, especially South Korea, and then you can see that South Korea's defense industry, and then South Korea's developing military relation with the NATO. It's propelled by the Ukraine-Russian war. And South Korea as a one, NATO as a one unit, as a collective, security, entity, as well as Korea approach individual, NATO members, country, not only in North America, the United States and Canada, but also in European partners. And then that actually largely, coincide with the United States, strategic move, as I explained in a few minutes ago. And then that actually highly correlated with this expansion of Korea's defense industry, Europe, and then, beyond. So you can see that this is a very interesting phenomenon. I don't know how, this type of security structural change will advance, but now you can see that this is a more like two-way game between Europe, Euro-Atlantic, and then Indo-Pacific. And it's not one-way game. Before it was just only west to east, but now it's east to west. It's going both ways, two-way political interaction, and then Korea actually in there. So it's a very symbolic at the same time, critical, change. Yep, yeah. And then Korea's nothing, growing. The Poland actually, it's interesting too. A new pseudo alliance in making, and then defense industry strategic cooperation. It's not just weapons, but also nuclear power plant and other strategic, industry. At the same time, high tech. South Korea invests a lot of money in the, the battery industry in the, Poland too. So you can see that Korea into, the European security, and then Poland, potentially into, East Asian security. I'll explain later in the Q&A session. And then it gives, Poland and South Korea more leverage against the, major European countries and anywhere else. Last part is the, two Koreas. So you can see that this, the defense minister of Russia, Shoigu, and then North Korean leader Kim Jong-un actually, dealing and then telling, with, those, ICBM and all those, the missile, technology and arms sale at the same time, the President Duda and Yoon Suk-yeol. So it's, those two Koreas, not just, South Korea, but, to a lesser extent, North Korea into this structural, change. North Korea and Russia arms deal actually has been widely, reported, and then especially in these days, missiles, and then very important. So this is critical. So these two, and then Russia actually proposed a joint military exercise with North Korea and then Russia and then China. This is mean that East Asian, the security and then Euro-Atlantic, especially the Central European, the security actually intertwined with each other, interacting with each other. This is a pretty unprecedented further, security integration, you can say. Okay, so this is my presentation, today, and then they are the well summarized and more detailed in the two publications. And if you are interested, you can read them. I think it's forthcoming this month also. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you for this very comprehensive overview and explanation about the emergence of the Korean defense industry. It was really fascinating, and indeed there will be even more details in the publications. Well, now I give the floor to Arnaud for some responses or queries, whatever you want.
Thank you very much, Françoise. Congratulations, Dr. Beck, for this very comprehensive presentation. I will not challenge it. I will just simply try to mention a few points you had no time to put on the table during this very dense presentation. First of all, I do not believe that Korea is a newcomer. When you see Korean involvement in the defense industry, we can say that it dates from the late 60s or early 70s, after Nixon doctrine during the Vietnam War, which was an electroshock for Korean defense industry, and all stakeholders would decide to invest massively in the development of defense industry in the country. So I think now Korea is just getting the benefits of more than 50 years of hard work. So first, it's not a not player, and when you say that in Poland, Korea was here by accident, I do not believe it was an accident. Korea was ready, and it takes time to be ready to answer to this kind of needs. And there is one point we have to mention: it's a very high, Korean investment in research and development. It's around 7% of all global defense spending. It's outspent only by Israel on this point. And this very high investment on R&D can explain how Korea could manage to develop so quickly into this field. You mentioned the relationship with the US, which is a very important one. The US is at the same time an accelerator and a breaker. It's an accelerator because it provided a lot of equipment and opportunity to South Korea. But at the same time, and I was a little bit surprised that you didn't clearly mention about it in your paper, like Korea is still dependent on several American technologies, and the development more ITAR-free product could be important for South Korea. For instance, the US can be a breaker for some deals, like in Uzbekistan, for example. And after the purchase of the F-35 by the Korean Air Force, the US refused to transfer some key technologies that Korea was requiring for the development of its own trainer jet, forcing Korea to look for new partners in Europe and in Israel. So in that sense, the US can be a breaker, but also an accelerator, because it's pushing Korea to develop more local technologies and to find for new partners. And in that sense, Europe can be an important partner for Korea, and probably a more important partner than what is it now, because there was already some success, in terms of aerospace. When we can speak about the development of helicopters in Korea, like the Syrian LAH, also in terms of development with Germany of submarines technologies. So Europe was there and will continue to be there. So we are not necessarily a competitor. We can be partner on many points, and it's very important to emphasize this element, knowing that now we are more in a kind of new way of relationship. It's not alliance, because between like-minded countries. And it's another point which is coming in my mind. It's if the US is a very important partner for Korea, it still sees Korea as a junior partner. Despite being one of the major allies of the US in Northeast Asia and in Indo-Pacific region, South Korea is not a part of Quad, is not a part of AUKUS, is not a part of the major security initiative of the US. And we can imagine that in few months there will be a new president in the White House, and he was president a few years ago. And we saw that, he was seeing like the American presence in Korea or abroad as a zero-sum game. And when there was like some negotiation, like for the to renew the presence of American troops in the US, he asked an increase of 400% to Korea, which was a bit surprising, So I think it's time for us to think like-minded countries, how we can work more closely, not to compete with the US, but not to be an alternative to the US, but to be an add value to this relationship we both have with the US, and to get more leverage and autonomy together, so that when our partner has some other focus, we still can work on our own interest. So this is mostly what I wanted to say on your presentation, which was very clear, very dense, very informative. Concerning the case of Poland, we will see what will be next. Is it one shot, or is it something which will be sustainable? I don't know, but what I am sure, and you say it, the Korean defense industry is here now, it's strong, it's reliable, and it will be there for quite a long time. And we saw that there was this diversification of the geographies of Korean market. Maybe 10 years ago, 50% of Korean export were focusing to Turkey. And now it's in Latin America, in Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in Malaysia. And there is another point maybe I'd like to mention. It's maybe we were speaking about like Europe-Korean partnership and cooperation, but also Pan-Asia cooperation, even in the development of the PAIK, for instance, between Indonesia and Korea. But once again, I'm looking forward reading the final version of your paper, which will be a great, how can I say, a very positive development on our reflection on how to increase Euro-Korean partnership. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Arnaud. If I want to reconcile your two positions about, was it an accident that Korea came up, broken in Poland? I think it's Korea was, as Napoleon would have said, Napoleon defines the hero as the one who is at the right place at the right time, and that's exactly it. But if Korea was there at the right time, it's because it has been preparing for a long time. So it's not by accident, indeed. So I think we can reconcile your two positions. You are not really saying such different things, I think. Yeah, I would like to hear more about the ITAR-free products. Yeah, ITAR, the regulation by the US, preventing other countries to export stuff, which include or integrate, US technologies. And because you said something about technology transfer from South Korea to Poland. Okay, but is that always possible, or would the US have to say something about this tech transfer? So I don't know if you could elaborate a bit. I mean, that goes along with one of the comments made by Arnaud, and then we'll open the floor to the rest of the public. Okay. So.
Thank you, Arnaud and Francois. And I think it's right place and right time. I think it's pretty much my argument. South Korea, it's Ukraine-Russian war actually was really tragic, but at the same time, open up the opportunity for Korea. I don't know how can I just explain and then digest this, but this is what happened, right place and right time. And then Arnold says large R&D investment. I think it's the South Korea's R&D, not just in the defense industry but also high tech industry. It's just amazing. I mean that actually, but it's done based upon the taxpayers agreement. I mean consent. So this is another interesting part. And then I think that this is it's a important fact for the Korean defense industrial development. I think so. And then accelerator and then breaker. United States again. I think it shows the strengths at the same time weakness. For South Korean defense industry, weakness part of more time. And then the United States actually have a lot of stake in South Korean defense industrial development. And then, for example, one more, FA-50, right jet fighter. This gas turbine engine is made by probably Lockheed Martin. Those gas turbine engine, if they say so the United States say no, then they cannot sell to anybody. But United States say yes. This is how it works. So now probably Donald Trump, and then you say the next president of the United States change, the entire security direction, not only toward Europe, but also, in the Pacific, region, then, defense industry will be impacted, by this. And, Donald Trump and then his, say, future administration might link, this technology issue with other, say, military expense, sharing, the negotiation, something like that. Then actually it's going to be big trouble, for South Korea. So then that's, it's a strength so far, but it's going to be a weakness, under some, different, administration. So it's related to product. Of course, technology transfer also is a big issue between South Korea and the United States. It's not just for the defense industry, but also other, strategic industry, say, the nuclear reactors. Westinghouse and then South Korea's, the company has a very big, conflict in it. So this is a big issue. So, but, it's negative at the same time positive for Korean defense industry. So, and for example, those in missile technology, and then they are mostly, of course, it's, the learn from the American, the technology from the very beginning, but move on. And so the United States actually declined or reject, to, technology transfer, especially missiles, ballistic and especially cruise missiles into, South Korea. So what South Korea did is just turn to France and Germany and especially Russia and Ukraine, and especially Russia. So those technology are not touched by the United States. The United States cannot, touch upon it. And then, for example, so K2, main battle tank. I just mentioned about the PAIK. This is German-made PAIK. And then Germany actually had one, the broke one deal between South Korea and was it Turkey? And then I think I don't remember. So Germany actually had Turkey, right? Yeah, they say just no. So South Korea couldn't, export. So this is a big constraint, but it's not just for South Korea. I think France and then Germany might be an exception, but the other, say, makers and then those the weapons makers have all kind of, shackles and constraint from the United States because the United States is just, top dog. So South Korea has more motivation to get more independent in, technology, sectors, but still it's a long way to go. And then that's the glaring weakness of South Korea. South Korean defense technology is 1.5 or second tier yet. So it's a long way to go. In that sense, South Korea wants to cooperate with more advanced countries, so France and then Germany. But it's I think it's when I dig it up more and more, and it's pretty complicated, other dynamics going on, other than the United States relationship too. And then that actually connect with even more. So and then I mentioned French strategic autonomy, European strategic autonomy. This integration between the region, Euro-Atlantic region and Indo-Pacific region, might compromise this European strategic autonomy credo. The United States wanted to combine them, but for France and then Europe, and it might not be good, In South Korea, the France especially don't want to get involved in the East Asian or in the Pacific affairs, even though France say it's an Indo-Pacific country, okay? And then Germany and others also are reluctant to get involved and then connected with the Indo-Pacific security. And then South Korean security, defense industry actually playing an important role in the European security. And then North Korea, you say, I just explained about it. This type of thing is just very clear evidence of this amalgamation, integration between these two regions, which is very, very compatible with the American, the integrated deterrence, the strategy. So in that sense, the United States might push, but France and then Germany and the other countries in Europe might be reluctant to receive and then accept Korea as the legitimate security alignment partner, and especially focusing on defense industry in Europe. So Euro-Atlantic, this type of thing is also we need to think about. And I make a joke about sixth generation jet fighter. Now there are two groups of sixth generation fighter in Europe, right? And in France and Germany and then Spain, right? Do you think you can do that? I mean, I'm not sure. And then other parts of UK, Italy, and then I think it's Japan. Japan was a pretty surprise, the element, player in sixth generation fighters. And then Japanese experts, and as far as I understand, they told me that, Japan plays a smaller role in developing these sixth generation fighters. But, what about South Korea? And then, a note mentioned about this Pan-Asia, say jet fighter, say Indonesia with South Korea. This is a long shot. So I mentioned about what about just joining say France and then Germany and then Spain, South Korea, joining that part. I say it's already very complicated, and then at the same time Korea. So I mean, but this type of say joke, it's unimaginable a few years ago. So now I can make a joke. So this is the the clear difference in the South Korea. So good. But India, Korea, Indonesia, sixth generation jet fighter development. This is very challenging. Probably Japan and South Korea and the United States clearly say no. They do their own. I mean, they don't need to. So the other countries can cooperate. But I made a joke about these sixth generation fighters. But in a few years, probably, we really seriously discuss about it. And South Korea need a nuclear engine submarine or attack submarine. South Korea is not developing nuclear weapon, but nuclear engine submarine is definitely necessary for South Korea. Not just aircraft carrier, but South Korea need it. And United States say no. Then France say yes. And anything happen this coming November in the United States, and then we actually have. So South Korea and then the European countries can be more flexible. Again, it's not just competition, but also open up the opportunity for the collaboration between these two, say, in the defense industrial producers. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I open the floor to the public. So are there any questions, remarks? Yeah, you raise your hands and the mic will be coming to you in a second. So introduce yourself and
yes, Jean-François Bureau from IO Conseil. Thank you very much for your presentations. My question would be about what is the views of the Korean government or political parties about exporting dual-use technologies. You mentioned at some point the interest for multi-purpose satellites. We know how the Korean companies are leading in some digital domains. So what is the perspective for exportations related to military products, which would include these digital technologies, space technologies? I've seen that a space agency has been created, has been set up some days ago in South Korea. So there is probably some ambition or opportunities for the industries to play a role in this domain of technologies. What is the view you can have? Thank you.
Are there any questions? We'll take a couple of questions if there are, and then we'll get back to the speaker. By the way, about the space program in Korea, there will be a paper published later this month on precisely Korea's space policy, space strategy. So you'll know everything.
Matt Scollay, Australian Embassy. Just a question on in this world of worst case scenarios and the like. I was interested to see that geography wasn't mentioned in a potential weakness of the South Korean defense industry. If there were to be a conflagration to the south of South Korea, how would South Korean defense products get to Europe, or vice versa? Like, how would South Korea contribute to the strategic depth of Europe if in that scenario? Yeah.
Sometimes understatements can be dangerous.
Good morning, Eric Desbeauvet. It seems that KEXIM has exhausted its lending capacity to Poland, and a bill has been introduced in July to increase the equity of KEXIM in order to extend new loans to Poland, because I think they have reached the concentration ceiling. What is your view on the? There's not a lot of information on the debate and how this demand has not yet been answered or fulfilled. Yes. It seems that they reached a limit and their equity has to be increased.
Okay, well, you have a lot on your plate.
Well, I mean, I'm working in Korean, say, Air Force community and say space community, but I'm not the expert of satellite technology itself. I'm working with my colleagues in the Yonsei University who are closely working with the Korean Air Force and the aerospace industry. But for in general, they are more open-minded to the export those the multi-purpose satellite, and then say compact advanced satellite, and then all those geostationary Korea multi-purpose satellite. And there are 3 products actually, mainly those focusing on, I think it's by Hanwha Aerospace or something, and then KAI and the other government R&D agencies are focusing on it. So South Korea has a pretty good satellite technology, as far as I understand. At the same time, South Korea has a launching capacity. If you remember Nuri, the launching system was successful a couple of times, and then they will actually develop it. And at the same time, South Korea tried to take advantage of SpaceX to actually put those satellites on it. And then, but so in that sense, South Korea is forming those ecosystem of space, and especially satellite community. And then, but I think it's still behind and then top technology holders such as the United States, France, and then Russia, and then but South Korea is catching up very quickly. But if you have some more specific question, then I can answer in afterwards. Sorry about that. And geography, Taiwan and South China Sea. Defense industrial point of view, I think it's Taiwan is going to be our again in a red line for China to say be okay with Korea. And then South China Sea, and then South Korea actually already exported FA light jet fighter to the Philippines, and it has a deal with I think it's Indonesia. Of course, Indonesia is developing with South Korea KF 21, and South Korea is trying to sell more weapons to the Vietnam. Then those deals it's getting more and advanced in coming years. Then China will be concerned, and then the other way around, the United States and other countries, say the Quad country and then AUKUS countries, and then they might be interested in the Korean defense industrial expansion in Southeast Asia and Oceania. But I know, as far as I understand, Australia, I'm closely working with Australian people in the strategic community, are very positive on South Korea to develop. And then France has a very bad experience. I don't want to refresh your memory on this the submarine deal, but South Korea doesn't have this type of thing. But as far as I understand, for Australia is going to be a pseudo ally, for South Korea in 10 years, in coming years. Even though South Korea is not a part of Quad, it's not a part of AUKUS, and then level of cooperation in the military census, context, it's rapidly growing, and then not just bilateral sense, but also in a multilateral sense. And then that means South Korea is getting more involved in the South China Sea and then Taiwan Strait in coming years. But again, South Korea is very, very cautious, to get involved within, Indo-Pacific, competition between China and the United States. Little in that sense, it's a little bit different from the Australian perspective. But South Korea is getting the posture or the strategic perception is becoming more similar with Japan. And I think that actually answers your question. And then defense industry too. Before, again, a few years back, if you talk about Japan, South Korea Defense Industrial Cooperation, that was completely joke. But these two parties might be able to discuss about this defense industrial cooperation. That's a huge change. Once Japan and South Korea do defense industrial cooperation, especially in the missiles capacity and other capacity, then China will be extremely concerned. And then that's going to be a game changer for this East Asian or Indo-Pacific security structure game. And equality issue. Still, it's a parliamentary power struggle. And the interesting thing is this issue is a bipartisan issue. And then funny thing is both party, Conservative Party and then Progressive Party, actually try to legislate, put the law to revise this AScent, the export equities financing system. That meaning that increase the limit to it's enough to accommodate Poland and other deals. But Korean those two parties, opposition party, ruling party, is doing the dogfight last several months, and then this important law revision actually signed for the last several months. I think it's a bipartisan issue. So after the general election, this coming April, then South Korean government, whether this is the regardless of the electoral the results and the consequences, and then South Korea will devise the law to increase the limit. One thing is opposition party, this progressive party, has a concern on the this excessive export financing. It's interesting because used to be the ruling party last government, and then they were all for the defense industrial the expansion. But the opposition party is a little bit concerned about this export financing the increase the limit. It is because Poland they say it's probably not capable of paying the debt in the incoming years. But I think it's reasonable. The concern, but it's underestimate, Polish state capacity in my view. But at the same time, this is a pretty healthy, check and balance in Korean, domestic politics, because it is unprecedented deal for South Korea too. Huge deal. And then they were like, wow, this is a big deal. But at the same time, they are kind of, it's not scared, but I think they're really concerned in how to deal with this. And then, they are reluctant to just go forward without, thinking anything. First, it's a big deal. Everybody say, let's go. But at the same time, there are a minority of, security expert, defense industrial expert, and then parliament and government, especially, some government ministry in charge of this, financing and, the treasury, and they are concerned about it. So there are check and balance still going on, but it's a majority of parliament members and then government officials and then Korean say public opinion for the increasing this export equity financing. So it will be done probably by this year. Okay, then that makes the deal moving forward, phase 2 deal, the phase 2 of the Polish-Korea deal. But at the same time, we need to think about Polish domestic politics too. Donald Tusk and Civic Team, and then with the two other the parties, the coalition actually declare that, and then just give a signal to Korea and then the other defense players that they wanted to review those deal done by those the previous government. Led by PIS. So this is a legitimate concern for Poland, legitimate concern for South Korea. So this type of big deal, and they need to check one more time for both parties for the becoming more sustainable. But then, we need to think about some more, security implication too. Again, if this deal is done, phase 1 is done, phase 2 partly done, 2 and 3, in the next several years, and then complete, technology transfer at the same time, localization, and then Poland and Korea just co-produce this lineup of the, conventional weapons, and then to start to export to other countries in Europe and other parts of the world, and then that's going to be really different maker, for the security structure. But that's the long way to go. And then, as you know, defense industry is not just commercial industry, it's just, state sensitive industry. So anything can happen. And then as, Ardo made a very clear message about Donald Trump, and then next, the new American president will decide a lot of, the part of the Korea's, defense industrial expansion in Europe and in the other part of the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you for these very comprehensive answers too. I guess we have come to the end of this seminar, and join me in thanking our two panelists for an excellent discussion and very insightful comments and very good presentation. So thank you. And keep an eye on IFRI's website to follow the two publications, the one on the defense industry and another one on the space, Korea's space strategy.